Good morning. Welcome to our virtual breakfast this morning. We have some great speakers for you. My name is Michelle Sweeten. I'm from the Eastern Upper Peninsula, and the sun has decided to come through my window. It's very nice and sunny here. I hope it is where you are too. I work with forages and livestock with MSU Extension. We have Dr. Jocelyn Smith from the University of Guelph to speak to us about the European corn borer this morning. So, Dr. Smith, if you would like to start sharing.
So yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you this morning about European corn borer. This is an old pest that's maybe making a bit of a comeback right now, which is not a good thing. So I'm going to explain to you what's been happening over the last couple of years with this situation. Yes, I'm based at the University of Guelph is kind of one of our biggest agricultural universities in Canada, and it's the main campus is near Toronto, but I'm based at the Ridgetown campus, which is only about an hour, maybe an hour and a half at the most, straight east of Detroit. So we're kind of neighbors, I feel like, pretty close together. But part of this talk is going to give you a little Canadian geography lesson, I'm afraid. So bear with me, and we'll put this all into context in a few minutes. But European corn borer, like I said, it's a pest that it used to be considered one of our most serious corn pests in North America. There's definitely yield loss associated with it. As the name implies, being a corn borer, it gets into the corn stalks and tunnels up and down inside those stalks, which can approximately 5% yield loss with one larva per plant was the old estimate. It causes a lot of stalk breakage, stalk rots that get into the plant because of the holes that the corn borers have to the outside of the plant. And they even will travel all the way up into the ears of the plant too. And this can result in more mycotoxin issues in the grain. So, like I say, it's been a historic pest, and you can see here there's some really old some old literature and newspaper clippings from Ontario here. And we used to even have a corn borer act in Canada that required growers to manage this insect because it was such a huge issue. And as they're in the corn stalks most of their life, and that's where they the winter as well. When wintertime, when it gets closer to fall, they go further down into the bottom of the corn stalks. And so that corn stubble is where they overwinter. Growers were required by the government to destroy that corn stubble either by plowing it under or burning it to control corn borers. And I'm sure you guys had something similar in the US as well. Chris Stefanzo found this kind of neat old ad about corn borer destroying America's $2 billion corn crop there. And you can see the top right, the northeastern part of the country, it showed the distribution of this pest back then. And we know that it came from Europe in the early 1900s and into the New England states and into southwestern Ontario was how it got here in broom corn originally. And so you can see below that caterpillar there is some of the states where it was found in the 1930s. But a more recent map shows the distribution of this pest now. It's in most of the areas in North America where we grow corn. And depending on your latitude, there can be more generations of this insect per year, right? Because they're all dependent on heat. So in our part of the world, probably in southern Michigan, southern Canada, we might get 2 generations per year. And in further spots into eastern Canada and out west in Manitoba, where we find them, there's just 1 generation per year. Now, to give you a little bit more on the background of this insect, because it was such a huge pest and difficult to control, because once they get into the corn plants in the stalks, you can't really get them with insecticides. So when transgenic corn was developed, this was the main target pest for that. And I'm talking about this BT corn that we've all grown so familiar with over the years, right? And so to give you a little history on the different BT proteins that were developed to control European corn borer, the original one was called Pri1AB, and this came out in like 1996 commercially by Monsanto at the time and Syngenta, actually, they were Ciba-Geigy, I think, back then. But this was the first protein that became available in products that we talked about. They were called yield guard, and there were different names too. But corn borer was the primary target pest. A little bit later on, Dow AgroSciences developed their own BT protein that we called Cry1F that came out in the Herculex corn back then. And then as time went on, 2008, there were two more proteins, Cry1A.105 and Cry2AB2 that Monsanto developed. And those are the ones that were put into Smart Stacks corn along with Cry1F. So if you think about these different cry proteins, the numbers and letters behind them have to do with the configuration of the proteins. But I just want you to think about these as kind of different active ingredients in corn plants that are genetically modified. So when the corn borers feed on it, it's going to kill them. And the corn borers were always extremely susceptible to these proteins from the very beginning. And in all the BTs that we've developed since, none of them have worked as well on any other pest as well as these did on European corn borer from the beginning. And so we know that this has been a huge success story to date, really, BT corn for corn borer. These little graphs on the left side of the screen there show corn borer surveys from Minnesota, Illinois, and Wisconsin that go back to the 1960s. And you can this on the the axis here. This is the mean number of larvae per 100 plants. You can see the cycling of the populations. They do kind of go up and down over the years with natural enemies and things. But that red line on the map on the graph is when BT corn came out, and you can see that since that time, the corn borer populations have really just declined across the Midwest. And we think we have the same situation in Canada, most areas where we're growing a lot of BT corn. So before BT corn, the ECB, the European corn borer, cost U.S. growers about $1 billion annually in yield loss and control costs. And since that introduction of BT corn, you can see these little graphs on the bottom show the cumulative benefits in $1 billion from 1995 to about 2008 for corn growers. And it's not just for growers who use BT corn, but we know that this has had a spillover effect into growers who grow organic or vegetable producers as well, because we've suppressed these populations across a wide area. And this insect doesn't only actually feed on corn, it will feed on about 200 different crops, including a lot of vegetables. So it's been a really beneficial tool in all of agricultural production. And like I said, it's been so successful. And the other interesting thing is that throughout this 25 plus years of using this technology, there have been no cases of resistance developing in European corn borer to any of those BT toxins. And, you recall that we've always had this refuge strategy that we had to use for preventing insects from developing resistance to BT. And that's probably helped that we did refuge with corn borer, especially in the early days when we were just planting a lot of those single BT toxins. But the real key here probably is that all of those BT toxins were high dose against corn borer. So they were extremely susceptible to them. It killed like 100% of the insects nearly that fed on the crop. So big success story. And one other little point about that too is that we also would see about a 50% reduction in mycotoxins like Dawn or vomitoxin, as some growers call it, in corn when we had BT controlling European corn borer. So that's really important to us in the Great Lakes region, as we all know as well. So if we go back in time, we know that since the introduction of this technology, we've gotten to the point where about 85% of all the growers in Canada, and in the US, the numbers are the same, use BT corn to control corn borer. So it's really kind of the norm now. Most of our corn has these toxins in it for corn borer. Now, as I said, here's your geography lesson on Canada and Canadian corn production for the day. So this map is a bit of a heat map of where all of our corn is produced in Eastern Canada. And so as you can see, most of it is down here in southwestern Ontario, just across the lakes from you folks in Michigan. If you go out to the east, Eastern Ontario, around Ottawa and into Quebec, there's quite a bit of corn production there as well. But the story that we're going to get into now actually takes place way out east here in the Maritime provinces. This is Nova Scotia on the bottom, New Brunswick to the north of it, and Prince Edward Island over here, also kind of a little bit to the northeast. And so, in terms of corn production, Ontario is obviously the big player. We've got about 2 million acres of corn every year, a little over that. Quebec is about 1 million or so. And then if you go to those eastern provinces like Nova Scotia, we're looking at maybe 36,000 acres of corn out east. So really, really small production area. But in 2018, we got a phone call from some colleagues out there that said, you should really come out here and take a look in Nova Scotia at some of the corn. We think we have corn borer injury in it, and it's BT corn. So I went out there in September of that year into a few fields that were planted with Herculex corn, so the Cry1F BT protein. And it was shocking because they were just loaded with European. We haven't seen corn borer infestation in hardly in any cornfields in Ontario for a number of years, and just to see this was pretty surprising. So on my map here up above, you can see these little yellow points. That's where I did all that collecting. This is at the end of the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, which is interestingly the place in the world where we have the highest tides in the entire world. We come in and out of there every day. Kind of cool to see. But anyway, in those cornfields in that area, I could find corn plants that were, fields that had anywhere from 30 to 70% of the plants in the field with corn borer injury in them. So one thing we do in my lab all these years is we do monitor BT susceptibility for corn borer across Canada wherever we grow corn. So we collected insects from all of those fields and brought them back to our lab. We also made a collection about 120 kilometers to the west, in an area they call the Annapolis Valley, which is a big, well, for Nova Scotia, a big agricultural area there, and made a collection out of some non-BT corn just to see if in case any of this resistance had spread that far. So we brought those populations back to the lab and we exposed them to different concentrations of this Cry1F protein. And we determined the LC50 value for the population, right? Like what concentration of protein killed 50% of the population. And so normally what we see with the corn borer is we would have an LC50 of about 6.5 nanograms per centimeter squared. That's just the concentration we use in these tests. And the response here on the left are the susceptible populations. You get mortality right off the bat. But all of those collections we made from Nova Scotia, we couldn't kill with like 200 nanograms of Cry1F per centimeter squared. So these things were at least 30 times more resistant to Cry1F than our susceptible populations in Ontario. So this was quite shocking because this has never happened before with European corn borer. So what was the response to this discovery? Well, part of the problem here, I think, this is part of our theory anyway, as to why this happened, is that because Nova Scotia and these maritime provinces are such a small market of corn production, they're short season, right? Like they use like corn that has 2,700 units or something. There's not a lot of options for the growers out there in terms of hybrids. And they were still using a lot of these single toxin hybrids that just expressed one protein, like Cry1F. That was a really popular one in that area. The rest of us in Southwestern Ontario and into the Midwest of the US, we've been using pyramided BT hybrids for a long time now, right? Where we have multiple of these BT toxins pyramided in the same plant. So you have like redundant killing of all these corn borers. But in these short season, small market areas, there's still being some of these single toxin hybrids out there. And anyway, so all they could do at the time was they didn't have a lot of the pipeline to even replace these with. The only thing we had was to remove the single Cry1F hybrids and replace them with a Cry1F, Cry1AB pyramid. So you know you've already lost Cry1F in that region, you're back to basically one protein. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. That's what was done for Eastern Canada because there really wasn't any other options at the time. We thought the government, CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, might say they have to stop growing BT corn altogether in that region, but they did not do that. They maybe should have, but they didn't. And so you'll see what happens next. But because this kind of sent off the alarm bells to the rest of the corn industry, we started to really increase our resistance monitoring again across Canada. And we're trying to figure out a whole bunch of things about the corn borers that are out east in Canada, because there may be some kind of isolation that happened there. to also push towards this resistance. But anyway, this is the map where from 2018, when we first found the problem, to 2020, we've increased our corn borer monitoring. You can see all these points on the map are where we made corn borer collections, basically all the main corn growing regions in Canada. And if you, this map just overlay on the next one, show you that these red squares are where we picked up some other prime 1F resistant. So we do have a bunch out there in the east, in Nova Scotia and into New Brunswick. We found a resistant population near Montreal, Quebec, and we found one way out west in around Winnipeg, Manitoba, kind of west of Winnipeg. So that was surprising. And then we also tested them against, Cry1AB, 1A.105, and 2AB2. And we did find a little bit of concerning or early warnings of resistance to Cry1AB and 1A.105 specifically, not so much with 2AB2. And I'll maybe mention that a little bit more again later. But so that's up to 2020. We do find some early warnings of resistance in Canada. In 2022, we went back to the scene of the original Cry1F resistance detection, where we know the growers were planting instead of just Cry1F, they were Cry1F, Cry1AB fields. We went into one of those fields, well, found 10 to 15% of the plants with corn borer injury. So this was our next sign that Cry1AB is starting to fail in that area also. So we've made a collection of that from that field, brought them back to the lab, and yes, this was our first confirmation of Cry1AB resistance with European corn borer in North America as well. Okay, that's 2022, and then in 2023, things are seeming to get a little bit worse. We've been working with Galen Dively from the University of Maryland he's been looking for resistance in corn earworm using sentinel plots of the different BTs out there. And we thought, well, let's double dip. We can probably use those plots to look for corn borer resistance evolution as well. And so we had one of those plots in New Brunswick, near Sussex, New Brunswick, which you can see that star on the map there. And in 2023, for the very first time, we saw a lot of corn borer injury to not just Cry1F, but also Cry1AB and Cry1A.105 and Cry2AB2 corn. So they were in everything in New Brunswick. And then another one of our collaborators down in Connecticut, Kelsey Fisher, she had one of these plots as well and actually saw the same thing in Connecticut. So she didn't have Cry1F in her plot, but she did have Cry1AB and Cry1A.105 and 2AB2 and had not as bad of injury as we did in New Brunswick, but she had some injury in those plots as well. So this is kind of the first time we've seen it in the US. And there's going to be a lot more monitoring in the US in the coming years for sure because of this. But yeah, we don't know if we sent those corn borers down to you from New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or not, or if this is a separate evolution of resistance in the population down there. You can see there's like 800 kilometers, as the crow flies for those corn borers to go south. But if this has been evolving for a number of generations, it's possible that they did move down that way from the eastern provinces. And here's just a picture of some of the corn plants from that as well. Okay, so just to summarize, where we're at with this situation now, we've confirmed that we have resistance with Cry1F in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Manitoba. Now, it's not necessarily widespread in all those provinces, but there are little pockets where we're seeing these resistant populations. We now see some Cry1AB resistance in Nova Scotia as well, and Cry1A.105 and Cry2AB2 resistance in New Brunswick and possibly Connecticut. So what is this? What are the implications of this for all of us? Well, bigger corn borer populations, or corn borers kind of making a comeback, as I mentioned earlier, maybe in Canada and the US. And this is all the things that we don't want to have to deal with, right? Increased yield loss, mycotoxins in corn because of the insect. People will probably want to spray for it again a bit more, which isn't that effective at times. Risk to other commodities like other vegetable crops, as I mentioned, that are hosts, could increase our populations in sweet corn. And we don't know if these resistant BT these transgenic Bt resistant corn borers will also be resistant to the foliar Bt products, but there's a good likelihood that they could be. And those are products that some organic producers can use. And this could have trade impacts too. I don't know. We'll wait and see what happens there. So the reason, we want everyone to be aware of the situation is so that you can be on the lookout for corn borer injury in Michigan or in other places in the US where you're working, especially if there are some of these single toxin Bt hybrids out there. Have a close look at those. And I know people haven't seen corn borer injury probably in a long time, so I hope some of the pictures here will help you recognize it. And we can, if we have time, I can spend some more time on some of those corn borer symptoms. If you see anything like this, we want you to notify your extension entomologist or your seed dealer so that there can be some collections made and we can determine whether there are resistant populations in your area. And for those in areas where we have resistance developing, we're trying to figure out what they can do about controlling corn borers again. And so again, I think I'm kind of over my time, so I can talk about some of that stuff later on as well. Maybe I'll stop there for now.
All right. Thank you for that really interesting information and for everything you covered. And now we're going to go to our question and answer time. Our first question came from John Oakley. And Dr. Smith, you answered this online, but let's go ahead and answer it in person. I'll read it for you, if that's okay. Do you think traits in sweet corn has any effect on spreading resistance to Bt traits?
Yes, thanks. That's a really good question. Everybody's thinking ahead now about how did this happen? And I'm sure, there's some contribution to sweet corn, but it's probably really, really small because there's just not a lot of sweet corn acres out there. And what there are sprayed quite frequently for probably corn earworm being the main target pest, but they definitely are going after European corn borer too. So I don't think there's a lot of survival of European corn borer in sweet corn for the most part. So yes, of course, anything we put out there does contribute a little bit of selection pressure, but I don't think that's going to be a major contributor in this case.
All right. Our next question from Bill Stengel. Can the timeline of migration of ECB from east to west in the last century be a forecast of the migration of the resistance timelines?
Yes, I really hope not, but one of the reasons I don't think we're going to see a lot of this hopefully pop up in the US is because we thought anyway that, like I said, most of the corn acres would be planted with pyramided Bt corn hybrids. So not those single toxin hybrids out there. But that's why I mentioned that we really want you to take a close look at places where you might think there are single toxin hybrids, because that's where the greatest risk is, most likely. And especially if Cry1F was the trait that was planted historically the most in those areas. When this all started, I think Chris DeFonso, she might be able to chime in on here a little bit too. We thought, as I said, these pyramided hybrids were in most places, but we did find pockets a lot more than we expected of single toxin hybrids. And I think there are still some areas where they're out there. I don't know why they're still out there, because they're not supposed to be out there. Like the recommendations from the EPA and from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency were that they should have been gone years ago and everything should have been a pyramid, which has a much lower chance of resistance happening. But if there's some strange kind of little markets where they're still planting those traded plants, those are the highest risk ones. So hopefully the fact that we have pyramids in most places will have slowed this down.
All right. Mitch Roth has a question about if the European corn borer is above threshold to warrant a spray, what insecticide products are most effective?
Yeah, I might have to call on Chris on this one. There has not been a lot of spraying for corn borer in field corn that I'm aware of forever because of Bt corn. We have some products registered in Ontario. They're going to have different names than what you have in the States, unfortunately. I don't know why they do that. But as far as I know, all the insecticides that are registered for corn borer are still very effective. I'm not aware of any resistance to insecticides with European corn borer for things that are currently registered. Chris, maybe you can confirm or deny on that one.
Yeah, and I'm older than Jocelyn, and I've never sprayed for corn borer. So, it's been 25 plus years of free control with a BT product, right? So, there are products listed. Coverage is going to be really key if you are spraying. But we're going in corn now for Western bean, and we're going in corn for fungicide, and we always talk about coverage there, and it's going to be it would be very similar. So the bottom line is we don't want to have resistance. We don't want to have to get to that point. And yeah, then I'll retire and Jocelyn will still be working, and it'll be very painful, I think, if we have to spray for corn borer again.
Yeah, all the people who worked on corn borer who are now retiring are warning me that this could be the thing I work on for the rest of my career if this does come back. Yeah.
Right, thank you. A question for Dr. Moore. With the chance of rain every 2 to 3 days, will the wheat crop start sprouting as in several years ago when it sprouted at 25 to 30% moisture? Or if somebody else can answer that one as well.
Michelle, I actually texted Dennis Pennington and asked him that question, and he said, it's possible you could have PHS resulting in lower falling numbers. And so that's something that's always a emphasis when we look at wheat out there. And so make sure and pay attention to the moistures on the wheat. And if it gets into the 18 to 20% range, consider combining and drying, cutting as soon as you can to remove some of that risk that's going to be out there. So it is a concern, but it's one of those things where we just have to try and manage the best that we can.
All right. Thank you. Glad you did that, Phil. All right. Pamela Smith has a question. If in those first Cry1 F resistance discoveries was a refuge being used, or in other words, has a lack of refuge contributed to the resistance?
So that's a good question. And we really we don't know for sure. In theory, because it was a single toxin hybrid being planted, there should have been a 20% structured refuge in those fields, block refuge, right? We don't track that anymore, as to who's really planting what in terms of refuge. And because when the refuge in a bag hybrids came along, it was just a given that you had refuge, right? But I hate to say this. I mean, I'm not trying to throw growers under the bus, but I'm pretty, my assumption is that they might have got a little slack on that 20% block refuge in this case, because, they're aware that pretty much everybody else can plant refuge in a bag. So, they didn't really maybe understand the importance of planting the block refuge with a single toxin hybrid. And the other interesting thing about this situation is that this did happen out in Nova Scotia, and we really never went out there before and connected with growers out east the way we're doing now. So, and also the corn acreage has increased a lot in the last 20 years in the eastern part of Canada. So they don't seem to have as much understanding or historical knowledge of these corn pests, and they're relatively new to them in a way. So I don't think they understood the risk that was there. And unfortunately, being out there, not having as much service from extension or research, it kind of flew under the radar for a while, I think. Yeah, kind of a worst case scenario here.
Thank you. Phil, your question is up next. What is the long-term outlook for rain, 30 or 60 days?
At least 30 days out, we're going to see less rainfall in southern Michigan, but the northern lower should be normal, and the UP should actually see slightly higher probabilities of rainfall than is normal for July and August.
All right, thank you. Eric Anderson has asked if European corn borer has ever been a pest to soybeans in Michigan.
Okay, yeah, and Chris responded there in the chat that they don't usually like soybeans as a host, but they can like dry beans, edible beans to some degree. But like I mentioned earlier, corn borer is interesting in that they will infest like 200 different plants. And so some of the crops that have had the most issues with corn borer, besides corn, would be peppers, field peppers. There's been some cases where wheat gets infested with corn borer, hemp, quinoa, like a couple of these more new crops are targets. Cannabis, I think, is one too. Potatoes, there's a lot of different things that they will infest, but soybean doesn't seem to be. Well,
Gladiolas, there's all kinds of odd. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's actually thought that their original host is actually hemp back in Europe because there wasn't corn. So they love hemp.
All right. James Dost asked, does the European corn borer life cycle lend itself to being effectively controlled with insecticides? 30 years ago, I don't recall anyone spraying for this pest in the field. May have been more about a lack of high clearance equipment.
Right. And yeah, it's been mentioned a couple of times that timing is really difficult with European corn borers for insecticide because like they do, it's similar to Western bean cutworm in a way, right? Like they lay their eggs on the leaves of the plant and you have this really short window from the time they hatch out of those egg masses into when they get into the plant where they're going to be untouchable. And so with corn borer, we talk about Western bean cutworm goes into the tassels and then down to the ears. Corn borer, they will get their eggs will be laid on the leaves of the plant, and they're really tiny. You think Western bean cutworm egg masses are hard to find? These are way worse because they're about a third of the size of Western bean cutworm egg masses, and those little larvae will go even into the midrib of the leaves of the plants within a day. So it's a real short window where they're going to be able to be contacted with insecticides. Once they're in the midrib, then they're into the stalk, and that's where they stay for the rest of their life cycle. So
yeah, and that first generation isn't necessarily hard to scout for because the corn is shorter and they leave characteristic damage. But that second generation, when the corn is taller, if you don't know what you're looking at, I think it's a much harder thing to scout for than Western bean cutworm. And that's hard enough. So that second generation could be really difficult if we don't have people who are skilled to go out in the field and actually do a really good job scouting, because that window, like you said, Jocelyn, is so short. There used to be talk, if you got 70% control with an insecticide, you'd be happy. That was kind of the old adage, from 40 years ago. So it's a very difficult pest.
Thank you. I think that's the end of the questions that I have seen. If I missed somebody, please let me raise your hand or something. If you're thinking of more questions, I'm going to open it up for our specialists to share. I know Chris has a few things she would like to share since she's still with us. So Chris, if you want to start, and if there's anybody else, we'll just jump right in.
Nope, I think I put in the chat that we've, Jocelyn and people in Michigan have both found Western bean cutworm already flying, and that's about 7 to 10 days earlier than what we typically see. So it's early like a lot of other things are. That's all. And I thank Jocelyn for her time with us today.
Are there any other specialists that would like to give a report? I saw Marty was on earlier. I don't think Dennis is on. So,
hey Phil, yeah, I'll chime in real quick. So tar spot has been confirmed in Monroe County, but like really low levels. I would definitely hold sprays as much as we can until tassel or afterwards. If we're only going to make one fungicide application this year, we would typically want to hit it between tassel and probably about the R3 growth stage, just depending on, tar spot progression. They don't want people to freak out and, hold those sprays. Don't go too early if you're going to make a single application. And that's it.
Eric had a question. Has anyone seen wheat being harvested yet or looking to start before the 4th of July? And Monica replied that she has several farms starting this weekend. Oh, looks like we have one more question for Dr. Jocelyn. Is there no concern for a variant like in rootworm's life cycle? John Oakley asked that. Does that make sense to you, Jocelyn?
I'm trying to think here. So when we talk about the rootworm variant, we're usually talking about the rootworms that will lay their eggs in soybeans. Call that the rotation resistant variant. I don't know if I'm on the right train of thought as you, John, about variants there, because with corn borer, the crop rotation doesn't have a big impact, right? Being that it's a moth. As I said, they overwinter in the bottom of the corn stubble, like the bottom 30 centimeters of the corn stalk, or the bottom foot or so. And in the spring, they come out of there and they fly to a different field, looking for the right stage of corn to lay their eggs in. So rotation doesn't have a big effect because they're going to move around in the environment somewhat there. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure.
I think it did answer the question. So we're going to wrap up and let everybody get on to their days. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank
And I
you.
want to say especially thanks to Jocelyn Smith, a special guest from Canada, and for Nathan Moore stepping in for Jeff Andresen. I appreciate all your help and your presentations today. Thanks, everyone. Have an excellent 4th of July. We'll see you in 2 weeks.